Decades ago, few could have imagined China, once a distant, impoverished revolutionary state, emerging as Africa's most influential development partner. But while the United States was consumed with Cold War rivalries, wars in the Middle East, and domestic priorities, Beijing quietly laid the groundwork for a deep and durable presence in Africa. It began with gestures of solidarity and evolved into a full-blown economic strategy built on infrastructure, trade, and diplomacy. In the 1960s and 70s, as African nations broke free from colonial rule, China extended support, not just ideologically, but practically. One landmark moment was the Tanzania-Zambia Railway, TAZARA, built from 1970 to 1975. Stretching 1,860 kilometers, it linked landlocked Zambia to Tanzania's coast, reducing dependence on apartheid-era regimes. Costing about $406 million and built with Chinese labor and expertise, it was China's biggest foreign aid project at the time. It came with no political strings, just China's rhetoric of South-South friendship. This was more than symbolism. It set the tone for how China would operate in Africa: visible projects, partnership language, and no overt conditionalities. Meanwhile, US officials remained focused on containing the Soviet Union and building alliances elsewhere. Few in Washington took notice of these early moves, let alone saw them as a strategic play. But China was planting seeds. Please take a moment to drop a like and subscribe to the channel. By the 1990s, Africa was in a difficult place. Debt crises and austerity programs imposed by Western institutions like the IMF had left economies fragile. Western nations, having won the Cold War, scaled back their interest in Africa's development. China, fresh off its own economic boom, saw opportunity. In 2000, Beijing launched the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, inviting leaders from 44 African nations. This wasn't a one-off summit. It became a triennial platform for pledging investment, aid, and mutual commitment. While US leaders were occupied with 9/11 and wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, China was offering deals on railways, ports, and energy grids. By the mid-2000s, the difference was stark. China's courtship was strategic, well-funded, and persistent. African leaders noticed. Senegalese President Abdoulaye Wade once remarked that China had a much better grasp of the urgency of African development than Western powers. And Beijing's promises came with action. From 2000 to 2020, China signed more than 1,100 loan deals with African governments, worth over $160 billion. These targeted infrastructure sectors, Western investors often avoided: roads, power, telecom, mining. Chinese companies poured into Africa, not just state-backed giants, but private entrepreneurs as well. Over 10,000 Chinese firms established operations across the continent. By 2009, China surpassed the US as Africa's largest trading partner. Its trade volume with Africa exploded to over $200 billion by 2013. And it wasn't just business. China also had more embassies in Africa than any other country, and was making dozens of high-level visits to African capitals. Its messaging, mutual respect, sovereignty, and win-win development resonated with leaders tired of Western lectures. The most visible aspect of China's presence has been infrastructure. Under President Xi Jinping's Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI, China financed and built thousands of kilometers of roads and railways, dozens of ports, and over 80 power plants across Africa. These weren't vanity projects. They addressed long-standing bottlenecks in African development. Take Kenya's Standard Gauge Railway, linking Mombasa to Nairobi. Opened in 2017, it cut travel time in half and freight costs by nearly 40%. The Addis Ababa-Djibouti Electric Railway opened in 2016, giving landlocked Ethiopia fast access to a key port. In Nigeria, Chinese firms built the Abuja-Kaduna Railway, and more lines are underway. Chinese engineers have also constructed airports, ports, and highways in Zambia, Mozambique, Angola, and beyond. These projects employed thousands of local workers and often transferred valuable skills. China's Belt and Road Initiative formalized and expanded this infrastructure push. By the early 2020s, 52 out of 54 African countries had signed onto the initiative. From the Suez Canal in Egypt to ports in Ghana and railways in West and East Africa, BRI projects filled crucial gaps. Critics warned of debt traps, but many African governments saw BRI as a rare chance to finance large-scale infrastructure with relatively fast execution. Western alternatives were limited or absent. Beyond concrete and steel, China invested in soft power. Over 60 Confucius institutes opened across African universities, offering language and cultural programs. Tens of thousands of African students received scholarships to study in China, many in technical fields. Chinese media outlets like CGTN expanded their reach, promoting stories of partnership and development. Perhaps the most iconic soft power project was the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa, a $200 million complex gifted by China. Completed in 2012, it symbolized Beijing's commitment to Africa and cemented its image as a reliable friend. Western criticisms about surveillance or debt rarely resonated on the ground. Many Africans saw these gifts as gestures of respect, something the West rarely offered. Of course, China's engagement was never purely altruistic. It needed Africa's resources. Countries like Angola, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Zambia hold vast reserves of oil, copper, cobalt, and other minerals vital to China's industrial growth. But Beijing offered an appealing formula infrastructure in exchange for resources. Angola became the poster child of this model. Post-Civil War, the country had oil but little money for rebuilding. China stepped in with billions in loans backed by future oil shipments. Between 2004 and 2020, China lent Angola over $40 billion, funding roads, housing, and energy systems. In return, Angola became one of China's top oil suppliers. The Democratic Republic of Congo followed suit. A 2007 deal, known as Sika Mines, traded copper and cobalt mining rights for Chinese-built hospitals, roads, and schools. By the 2020s, Chinese firms controlled much of the DRC's cobalt sector, a metal crucial for electric vehicle batteries. Chinese investment also surged in Zambia, South Africa, and Sudan, often in sectors too unstable or unattractive for Western firms. Where the West offered tough loan terms or pulled out due to instability, China moved in. It secured resources, built extraction infrastructure, and embedded itself in long-term supply chains. Critics cried neocolonialism, but many African governments pushed back, noting that China paid for resources and built lasting infrastructure. The comparison with past Western behavior, extracting without investing, only strengthened China's image. In contrast, the US approach in Africa centered more on security than development. AFRICOM was established in 2007, and American troops, drone bases, and counter-terror operations spread across the continent. These initiatives often left the regions more destabilized than ever, and they didn't win popular goodwill. One African observer quipped, "The US sends soldiers, China sends engineers." It was a telling distinction. Economically, US-Africa trade declined in the 2010s, in part due to America's own energy independence. By 2021, US trade with sub-Saharan Africa was about $45 billion, just a fraction of China's $254 billion. US development efforts like Power Africa or Prosper Africa existed, but they were fragmented and modest compared to China's state-backed coordination. Only in recent years has the United States tried to counter China's influence more directly. Initiatives like the G7's Global Infrastructure Partnership emerged in 2021 to rival the Belt and Road Initiative. But many African leaders saw these efforts as too little, too late. While the United States warned of Chinese loans, Beijing was already entrenched with signed contracts, physical infrastructure, and deep diplomatic ties. By the early 2020s, China was seen by many in Africa as a reliable partner, far from perfect, but present. The US, in contrast, struggled to shed the image of an absent or condescending actor. Recent efforts to re-engage face an uphill battle. Chinese firms and officials are now embedded across the continent, and Africa's infrastructure, trade, and energy flows increasingly connect eastward. China's rise in Africa was no accident. It was a deliberate long-term effort combining statecraft, investment, and relationship building. While the US focused on other regions or sent military advisors, China built roads, schools, ports, and influence. The result, a continent deeply linked to Beijing's economic future. The story isn't about Africa being dominated, it's about African nations choosing partners who show up. China showed up and delivered, while every deal with the US left Africa worse off than before. If you enjoyed the video, Please consider dropping a like and subscribing to stay tuned for more videos.